There's a certain kind of chaos that only exists when someone decides they already know the truth and then refuses to let facts interfere. That mindset, the "I've decided, don't confuse me" energy, sits right at the center of this entire situation. And according to the unsealed evidence, that's exactly how this spiral began. What was framed publicly as an untraceable smear campaign doesn't actually hold up when you slow everything down and look at who was moving behind the scenes, who had access, and who benefited most from the confusion. Because if this case had a true origin point, it wouldn't be press coverage or leaked headlines. It would be one person, Stephanie Jones, former publicist to Justin Baldoni, the connective tissue between almost every claim, accusation, and contradiction that followed. Without her actions, this entire narrative simply wouldn't exist in the form it does now. Stephanie's professional relationship with Justin didn't just end quietly. It collapsed alongside internal fallout involving a former employee, Jen Abel. What happened next is where things cross from messy into genuinely alarming. Jen's phone, containing private messages, work communications, and personal data, was handed over to Stephanie under what was described as a very specific promise. The phone would be unlocked temporarily so its contents could be transferred during a Verizon store visit. That transfer never happened. Instead, Jen was left without her phone, without her number, and without access to what would later become explosive evidence she didn't even know existed yet. That phone didn't just disappear, it became leverage. What makes this even more disturbing is the timing. Jen was scrambling to rebuild her life, unaware that her private messages were about to be used to fuel allegations far beyond her control. And those messages wouldn't stay contained. They would eventually make their way into legal complaints, media narratives, and accusations that painted an entirely different story than what the full context actually showed. At the same time, Stephanie's animosity toward another publicist, Melissa Nathan, was intensifying. This wasn't subtle. By her own testimony, she hated Melissa. Not professionally disagreed with, not had tension with, hated. And that hostility wasn't abstract. It traced back to business relationships, perceived betrayal, and one very specific power shift: Scooter Braun choosing to support Melissa's career rather than continue his professional alignment with Stephanie. That decision mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. Stephanie didn't just privately dislike Melissa. She actively tried to stop others from working with her. She warned colleagues. She framed Melissa as unethical. She invoked emotionally charged stories to persuade people that hiring Melissa would be a moral failure, not just a business choice. And she didn't stop there. She reached out to decision makers connected to Justin, insisting they were making a mistake, framing herself as the only person brave enough to speak up in a room full of yes people. But what's striking is how much of this opposition relied on speculation rather than proof. Allegations were presented as facts. Assumptions were repeated until they sounded like established truth. And when those claims didn't land the way she wanted, the narrative shifted again. This is where the idea of a smear campaign becomes deeply ironic, because while accusations were flying about planted stories and media manipulation, the behavior being described matched long-standing criticisms made against Stephanie herself. The tactic of creating a problem and then positioning yourself as the only person who can fix it, the hero complex, the controlled chaos. And yet, when the pressure mounted and blame needed to go somewhere, Stephanie didn't turn inward. She turned outward, toward Melissa, toward Justin, toward anyone but herself. What makes the situation even more complicated is that Stephanie had no prior relationship with Blake Lively before all of this. No history, no personal connection. And yet, after being blocked from influencing studio decisions directly, she pivoted. Fast. She reached out to Blake's camp on the same day she gained access to the phone. Suddenly, she was offering warnings, painting scenarios, suggesting threats, framing herself as the whistleblower in a story she was quietly shaping. That moment matters because it reframes everything that followed. From that point on, narratives hardened. Confirmation bias took over. Once the idea of a coordinated smear campaign settled in, every headline, every article, every social media post was interpreted through that lens. Evidence wasn't examined, it was filtered, and anything that didn't fit was dismissed as manipulation by the very people accused of manipulating the press. But the deeper you go into the messages, the timelines, and the actual sequence of events, the harder it becomes to ignore one core reality. The chaos wasn't created by outsiders. It came from inside the house. And once that door was opened, there was no clean way to close it again. Once you stop looking at this like a headline-driven scandal and start looking at the paper trail, the story shifts hard. Because when Stephanie Jones finally sat down under oath, the version of events she presented didn't strengthen the smear campaign theory, it cracked it open. Her deposition didn't introduce clean facts, it introduced motive, fixation, and a pattern of assumptions dressed up as certainty. A huge part of her testimony centered on why she believed Melissa Nathan was unethical, and instead of pointing to documented misconduct, she told a story, a tragic one involving a young woman who died of an overdose in a hotel after a man associated with one of Scooter Braun's circles had already left. No charges, no criminal findings, no evidence of wrongdoing. But Stephanie framed the situation as something dark and deliberately covered up, placing moral blame squarely on Melissa for how the situation was handled publicly. That framing mattered because Stephanie didn't keep it to herself. She used it. She texted colleagues. She called decision makers. She appealed emotionally, even invoking motherhood, telling one executive that as a mother of 5 girls, she should understand why aligning with Melissa was wrong. This wasn't neutral advice, it was persuasion by moral panic. And yet, despite all that pressure, Melissa was still hired, not because of Jen Abel, not because of Justin, but because another executive already had a working relationship with her and trusted her experience. That decision alone seems to have deepened Stephanie's resentment, because from that point forward, her actions weren't about protecting a client, they were about stopping Melissa. That's where Scooter Braun comes in. Stephanie admitted to texting him directly, accusing Melissa of planting media stories in order to later kill them and look like a hero. It's a serious allegation, but when pressed, she acknowledged it was speculation, a belief, something she felt strongly about, not something she could prove. Here's where things get uncomfortable. The exact tactic Stephanie accused Melissa of, creating a problem so she could swoop in and solve it, was the same behavior former employees had already accused Stephanie of in prior reporting. The projection is impossible to miss, especially when you look at what actually happened with the press. The article that triggered so much outrage wasn't planted by Melissa. It came after multiple people, including Stephanie herself, had already been in contact with reporters. When confusion followed, Melissa didn't escalate it. She responded. That's literally her job. She spoke to journalists, clarified inconsistencies, and pushed back on framing she believed was inaccurate. That wasn't manipulation, that was standard crisis management. But inside the complaint later filed by Blake Lively, that context disappeared. The focus narrowed obsessively onto a few social media posts and one article, framed as proof of a coordinated attack. What didn't make it into that narrative was the full text message history showing how many conflicting voices were already feeding the press before Melissa ever stepped in. And that omission matters, because when full text threads eventually surfaced, they told a completely different story. They showed Melissa reacting, not instigating, cleaning up, not planting, and they showed how chaos had already been set in motion by overlapping, competing narratives coming from inside Blake's own orbit. This is also where the role of major outlets becomes impossible to ignore. The New York Times later referenced having reviewed thousands of messages, but the specific excerpts used publicly stripped away the surrounding context that explained why messaging was confusing in the first place, not because someone was scheming, but because too many people were talking to too many reporters at the same time. Meanwhile, Stephanie still had possession of Jen Abel's phone. That detail alone should set off alarm bells. Jen didn't have access to her own messages. She couldn't verify how they were being interpreted or shared. And yet, those messages became foundational to allegations that reshaped public perception. At this point, the narrative had fully flipped. The person accused of orchestrating a smear was the one actively stopping stories from escalating. The people claiming to be under attack were the ones feeding contradictory information into the press cycle, and Stephanie, positioned as a truth-teller, was actually the common denominator connecting nearly every point of misinformation. What's wild is that none of this required a conspiracy. It didn't need secret meetings or burner phones. It just needed resentment, access, and someone willing to frame their assumptions as fact and say them with enough confidence that others would stop questioning. By the time the dust started to settle, the damage was already done. Reputations were bruised, alliances were locked in, and the truth became harder to untangle not because it was hidden, but because it was inconvenient. By the time everything was out in the open, the most uncomfortable truth wasn't about bad press or messy PR. It was about alignment. Once Blake accepted Stephanie's version of events, there was no neutral exit. At that point, they were functionally locked together. Because backing away wouldn't just mean admitting a mistake, it would mean admitting that the wrong person had been trusted from the start. That's why this didn't de-escalate. It escalated. Stephanie's warnings turned into certainty, speculation hardened into accusation, and Blake, already primed by confirmation bias, interpreted every negative headline as proof that she had been targeted, not criticized. The idea that public reaction could simply be organic, that audiences might disagree with her, never really entered the equation. What makes this especially revealing is how often Stephanie contradicted herself once full message threads surfaced. In public, she denied contacting certain outlets. Privately, screenshots showed her acknowledging those exact communications. The gap between what she said and what the messages showed wasn't small. It was structural. And once those receipts existed, the narrative of a shadowy smear campaign became almost impossible to defend without omitting context. That context is exactly what went missing when selected text excerpts were used to support claims against Justin Baldoni. When messages were isolated, they sounded damning. When read in full, they showed professionals reacting to chaos they didn't create. The confusion referenced in text wasn't strategy, it was exhaustion from dealing with multiple conflicting storylines being pushed at once. A major source of that chaos was Leslie Sloan, whose repeated outreach to reporters created overlapping narratives that then required damage control. Instead of one clear message, there were several. Instead of silence, there was saturation, and every new article forced another response, another clarification, another attempt to steady something that never needed to spin this hard in the first place. What's striking is that Melissa Nathan's messages, when read in sequence, consistently show restraint. She didn't escalate attacks, she didn't manufacture outrage, she focused on removing inflammatory framing, correcting inaccuracies, and limiting fallout. That's not a smear, that's containment. And it's exactly why Stephanie's hostility toward her makes more sense emotionally than factually. Because at the core of this isn't a media conspiracy. It's a professional rejection that metastasized. Scooter Braun chose to support someone else. A client moved on. Influence slipped. And instead of accepting that shift, Stephanie reframed it as betrayal, then as danger, then as moral wrongdoing. Once that story was built, it only needed the right audience to stick. Blake became that audience. Not because she was malicious, but because she was vulnerable to a narrative that explained her discomfort without challenging her self-image. If someone else was orchestrating harm, then she didn't have to reflect on how her own actions were landing. She just had to fight. But fights built on partial truths don't end cleanly. Because now, even if Blake wanted to walk this back, she couldn't without implicating her closest ally in the very behavior she claims to condemn. And Stephanie, for her part, has already demonstrated she's willing to burn bridges, expose private communications, and rewrite history to protect her position. That's why this story feels so extreme. Phones taken under false pretenses, messages stripped of context, media outlets fed selective information,
and an entire legal narrative constructed around an assumption that collapses the moment you zoom out. If there's a real villain here, it isn't bad press or public opinion, it's the refusal to accept accountability. Because criticism isn't always an attack, and not every negative headline is a conspiracy. Sometimes it's just the result of too many people speaking when fewer should have, and one person deciding they'd rather set the house on fire than admit they were never the hero of the story. That's how this became what it is, not because of a smear campaign, but because someone couldn't let go, and someone else believed them.